So today we want to really build upon a general honor race session and get into some really detailed conversations with folks who really are involved in the activities and supporting our disasters. Excuse me. We're going to really focus on giving an overview of the key lessons learned. As was mentioned earlier, we were hit with a massive number of hurricanes and events this year that we expect the trend to continue. We're going to have a bunch of disasters, whether it's earthquakes, forest fires, hurricanes, hopefully not any man-made events, but we're definitely going to talk about how we're prepared to deliver that. I want to really set some expectations, though. We're not going to be half as exciting as General Honorary was yesterday. Right? So in the spirit of under-promising and over-delivering, I want to make sure that's very, very clear. Last night on my 2-hour commute home, I was thinking of all the ways I was going to work with my son, who is an engineering student at Virginia Tech. We're going to build this black box. We're going to power it up. We're going to take this idea, and I'm going to take it to Shark Tank, and we're going to be rich. He gave me a million reasons why we couldn't put that much power in a small box. I kept telling him, it's only impossible because you haven't done it yet. So I failed miserably with that with him. The next portion I'll say is this. The folks in the back, the AV guys, you can take your hands off of the censor button. This session is going to be completely G-rated. To get prepared for that, though, we do have glasses on the front of every table in front of these folks, so we're going to use those as swear jars. So if anybody gets a little bit frisky there, we're going to use that for the scholarship fund for NDTA. Okay? So there's some key points that General Honorary used yesterday that we really want to focus on today. Be aware. Be your own first responder. Do the routine well. Be prepared for change. Making sure that we're resilient and be able to respond to these disasters. And then utilizing commercial capacity. So I think we have a great group here that's going to be able to speak to all those items and from their different perspectives. And so I'll allow these individuals a couple of sentences just to kind of introduce yourselves, who you are, what you do, and who you support. So we'll start with the government first.
Hi, my name's Tibbs-Brewer. I'm with U.S. Northern Command out at Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado. I work in the J4 Directorate, the Logistics and Engineering, and in particular, we work in a mobility division where we coordinate the lift and the requirements for interagencies, DOD, and other agencies in support of natural disasters. NORTHCOM was a combatant command that was formed after 9/11. Its AOR includes the United States, Alaska, Canada, Mexico, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. Thanks.
Very good. Ted Lawson, National Travel. We've handled FEMA for, 19 years. And it's always our honor to serve FEMA. And General Andre, I'm glad that we're just a small part of this, but we do the logistics and the travel management behind it. My staff will tell you I have about the same vocabulary when a storm is going on as General Andre does. And so it's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Bryan Scott with Enterprise Holdings. We're the parent company for Enterprise Rent-A-Car, National Car Rental, and Alamo Rent-A-Car. My team is responsible for all of our federal government programs, which put us right on the front line to assist the government's needs during what I call Florida, Texas, and Puerto Rico. So,
Awesome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, guys. So anyone who's had any chance to talk with me at all knows that I'm very passionate about public service. I started my career with the Department of Homeland Security. In the first few months of me being there, Katrina hit, and we were responsible for trying to make sure that the folks at the airports that were in the affected areas had the support they needed to conduct their missions by pulling the folks who were on the actual airport so they can focus on their families, deploying those folks so they could support. I spent 12 years within DHS in several roles to include representing the Office of Finance and Administration with the Eagle Horizon event that FEMA puts on every year to get prepared and making sure all the resources are brought together to ensure that they're prepared for a disaster when it comes. So what we really want to start off with first is from NORTHCOM's perspective. Can you give us an idea of how you coordinate and interact with the different resources internal to the government, and what activities kind of go on to prepare for a particular disaster from your perspective?
So when we see a hurricane start forming, it gets everybody's interest in the headquarters, and we start monitoring it. We're interested in where it's at, where it's going to, and what the strength and projected strength is. Normally, from our perspective, our involvement is once that hurricane is projected hit a Category 3, then usually that's when we get involved with it. Otherwise, it's handled by the states and the local authorities. But in DOD, we're the supported combatant command. So we are the lead for DOD to support the efforts. But I want to point out that we're not in charge. We're supporting the lead federal agency, and normally it's FEMA if it's in the United States. So they're in charge. We're supporting them. We're taking their requirements. We're looking at what they're going, anticipating what they're going to need, and we're opening lines of communication with them. In the meantime, we're looking at, with a notice event like a hurricane, what installations are nearby, what are the airfields, the aerial ports that we may be able to use, and we start monitoring that and keep an eye out. If it looks like the hurricane's going to hit somewhere like South Texas or Louisiana, we also anticipate that there's going to be evacuations prior to the hurricane making landfall. And so we'll be working with Transcom, who supports us. We don't have any lift at all at NORTHCOM. We get it all from Transcom. We have a very close relationship with them. And so if it's going to hit an area that we're going to do evacuations prior to, we're working with them. We're working with Transcom Acquisitions to, if it's a general population evacuation, to do a market survey with the commercial companies to see what their capabilities are. Because our perspective is that mill areas is a short and a high demand commodity, and we use it for fighting DOD efforts otherwise. So if we can convert something to commercial industry, we're willing to do that, and we push for that. If it's patients, if it's Louisiana or South Texas, we could be moving patients, and we work with the Transcom Surgeon General for air medical evacuations. But the main thing is that we're opening lines of communication. We're talking with the FEMA Movement Coordination Center, Transcom, and anybody else that might be involved with this.
Sounds good. So it sounds like we're really focusing on being aware and being our own first responder. We're really being prepared. Now, once all that coordination occurs, we have to talk to someone to execute those plans, right? So someone's got to be our point guard to be able to get us mobilized to move forward. Mr. Lawson, can you describe what's the perspective from industry, and how does the TMC involve itself in helping to coordinate the activities from the government?
Well, if you visualize it from a standpoint, we're really a distribution center and a logistics center in support of FEMA and all of its elements. And we start watching for instance, on the hurricanes, we start watching them as soon as they come off the coast. After 19 years, we have a lot of experience and a lot of infrastructure. But looking at it, we begin to catch it and track it. And we're very used to the European model versus the U.S. model, and what are the possibilities of this. And as it moves closer, then we open up our communication even more so with FEMA and also the vendors such as rental cars, hotels, airlines, and see what the possibilities are. And from that standpoint, some statistics that I think you might be interested in. In Katrina, for instance, we moved 73,000 people in about 6 weeks. That includes all the FEMA personnel, but then the evacuees going out. And each storm has its own uniqueness about it. Our offices in Charleston, West Virginia, and we're a little immune to most major things, so we're hidden in the mountains to start with, but the floor of our offices become almost like a commodity center. There's a lot of, we need 50 hotels in this area, we need 300 air seats, and so on and so forth. And so as it goes along, we look at it on a macro scale, but then we look at it on a micro scale. And the micro scale is we must get certain teams of FEMA in and out very quickly. With that, we have specialists who are coordinating with the airlines, and I will tell you, as this 19 years has evolved, the GDS systems, the global distribution systems, are magnificent. They pull in information of inventory that we're looking for instantly, but once the storm hits, then we have to call every hotel and see what their position is. Then we're talking to the rental car companies, and gee, we need 300 cars in this position, we think, and FEMA is keeping us involved in saying this is what we think we need at this particular area. Sandy was an interesting case that in the fact that once the storm hit, it caught everyone by a little surprise of how intense it was, because it was more than a northeasterner. It was the perfect storm, as the book said, and it came at two different directions. And with that, the marathon runners in New York had all the hotel rooms. And so then we had another problem of where are the hotels going to be exactly. And so the marathon runners were eventually evacuated, but then we had, on top of that, then we had the evacuees who had no place to go. And that's not uncommon. And the evacuees will come first above everything else. So then we had to move people between the different hotels down into New Jersey and so on and so forth. And New Jersey per diem rates, which sounds minor, but it plays a part because those per diem rates have to be raised depending on what the demand is. And so all of this chaos is happening as we're taking, well, in this last storm, we took 30,000 calls in 10 days for assistance in somewhere. But what we try to do is we try and take the micro scale, then bring it down to each individual. In other words, if someone shows up at a hotel and they don't have a room and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, we've got to find a room for them somewhere. And particularly the FEMA workers, as they're coming in on the airplanes, we're tracking them. We're tracking them to the rental cars, then we're tracking them to the hotels. They get to the hotels, there's no room. And so then we're finding where can we find this place. And when it gets to that scale, we have specialists internally who take on the problems as they occur. During Katrina, we had a little girl was on a train evacuating to Houston. She was 13 years old. She got off in the middle of nowhere. And so we had this little girl sitting in a station, and she doesn't know where to go. We assigned 2 people to that. Eventually, we extradited her out of that area, but it's that type of minute detail that we always look at. And with that, we're constantly talking to FEMA back and forth. We actually put people on the ground during these last hurricanes. We had people on the ground in Austin, we had them on the ground in Houston, Hanson, Alabama, which is a training center, Atlanta, Orlando, Tallahassee, and then finally San Juan. And they're feeding us information. Our people are feeding us information. And FEMA allows us to sit in on the logistics meetings, so we're constantly adjusting back and forth. I would tell you the hotels and the airlines and the rental cars do a great job. Delta Airlines put a flight on essentially for free out of New York down to San Juan. And it was a tremendous gesture. So that's essentially what we do.
Sounds good. So now we have our industry partner, right? So you're getting the request from the TMC, and they're getting all types of information, all types of requests in from different sources. You've got folks asking for the same set of cars, the same 500 number from 4 or 5 different people. How are you taking that information, processing it to make sure you can deliver?
Well, I think it all starts before the storm even hits. Like Ted mentioned, we're watching the weather. It's difficult for us to pre-plan and move assets to an area until we know where the impacted area is going to be and where the need is going to be. So pre-storm is where it all begins, and it's us notifying our operators in the field that the storm is imminent, and we need to expect the worst and make sure that we've got people's phone numbers, that we can reach them after hours. Storms don't worry about business hours, so and the government doesn't worry about business hours. So the need is is ongoing throughout 24/7. So we plan to be available. And then when the storm hits, our first priority is our people. Our people are embedded in the area. They're already there. We have offices and they have homes. And a counterpart from Avis said it best yesterday that our people are victims too. So the first thing that we do is we perform an asset check first on our people to make sure they're safe. They are focused on their families, making sure that their loved ones are safe, that if there's elderly people that they're caring for, that they've got the medicines and the stuff that they need, that if there's no schools, are they focused on, they're taking care of their families first. Then we look at our assets. Are our branches open? Do they have phones? Do they have computers? Can we get employees in there? And then if the branch is open, are the vehicles available? So we do an asset check first and foremost before we start talking with the government and then with the distributor about what we can and what we can't do. Pre-planning's tough because, as Ted mentioned, for Houston, Houston, you couldn't get a vehicle, you couldn't get into Houston, I think, for the first week. So even though we prepared Houston and we said, it's coming, you're going to get hit. We usually know that about a day out, that you're going to get hit. Be prepared, and once you turn the lights on, we'll be ready to direct some business in there. But the business didn't go to Houston. All the business went to Austin and to Dallas. And in Florida, initially all the business went to Alabama and Atlanta. So in those areas they weren't, when you look at the Weather Channel, they weren't going to get impacted severely like southern Florida was. So they're going about their business. So we've got to wait to react until we know where the assets are going to be needed. And then once we know that, we can begin to service and provide.
Yeah, one of the things my grandmother used to always tell me was that when you plan, God is known to laugh. So it sounds like you do a lot of preparation and a lot of activities to be prepared for the disaster. Well, what happens when the unexpected occurs, right? So we are really reliant upon technology. So whether it's the GDS, whether it's our travel systems, whether it's our telephone systems, the electrical grid,
right,
those things are susceptible, right? So things happen. How do you guys respond in an environment to where all those creature comforts that we've come to know and love are no longer available? There are no phone lines. The electrical grid is down. Can you guys, in your own individual turn, it's not directed at any one particular individual, can tell us how you kind of plan or how you actually operate in those environments to where the technology just isn't there?
Well, just from our perspective is that, the key to responding to an event is the preparation that goes beforehand. So it isn't just doing the preparation when we know there's a hurricane. It's a preparation that we do throughout the year, that we work with the interagency partners and throughout the year through exercises. We do transportation feasibility studies. So we'll take a scenario, and it could be an earthquake in the Cascadia subduction zone. It could be a nuclear detonation. It could be a hurricane. But we take that, and we get all the interagency partners and what they're anticipating that they're going to have to send into that area, in addition to what we're going to send into the area. And we throw it the program's called JFAS, and it gives us a feasibility. It tells us, hey, this is how much stuff you're going to be able to get into. An interesting point is that what we find is it's not normally the number of aircraft that's the problem. It's the throughput, getting it to the airfield and getting it off the airfield. And that's what we work for and we strive with. So we take our interagency partners like FEMA, we get their priorities, we mix in our priorities with that, and then we run that and say, well, this is how many short tons, this is how many aircraft we can get in there a day, this is the maximum on ground and the like. And it's really been an eye-opening for our partners and for us about what the limitations are and what we can actually bring in there and how long is it going to take us to get there. So our key is to keep working with them. We don't want to meet a new agency when an event's happened or happening. We want to meet them in advance and talk to them. And another issue that we've done with that is what we call the ITSIF, it's the Interagency Transportation Support Framework, where we've reached out to our partners and said, tell us which teams that you're going to need to send within the first few days, and we'll work with those teams. We'll get their data, we'll get them training, because what we found during the Katrina days and the like was that when we went to move these civilian teams, they weren't ready at all. They had no idea what it was going to take to get on a DoD aircraft. You know, you don't drive up to the airfield and get on the plane and go. It just doesn't work that smoothly. There's a lot of prep that goes in that. So for us, we do the prep work in advance. When an event happens, be it no notice or not, we already have those communication lines open, and we're working with our partners on it.
Okay.
Well, then it also comes as what is a surprise? Actually, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the fires, they all have an element of surprise with them because they all react differently. In the last 3 years, the government initiated a surge campaign, reach out beyond FEMA, bring in other people from different agencies, which I thought was brilliant. Logistically, it became very difficult because all of a sudden they had their TMCs where we were coordinating with and so on and so forth. And one of our secrets to making things work is to keep track of people as they're moving through. In other words, if we know that when they reach this hotel, we need 150 rooms tonight, and we know exactly when they're going to arrive from the airlines, we know the rental cars, and so on and so forth. Once we don't have part of that information, then we have to do it by hand and by phone. And it's tedious, but by the same token, there's always a surprise element as we go along. We have talked about what happens on a terrorist thing that is major, and we are working on that to see what we can do as support. Our job is really distribution and support, and so that is our key element. And a lot of our work actually happens after the fact. In other words, once the storm has moved on, that's when the FEMA personnel come in mass with the rental cars, with support and inspectors and so on and so forth, and that becomes the critical key. In fact, our staff is still currently working on the last 3 hurricanes because you have all the people still deployed out there. It took a while for us to get into San Juan and really get help. Now, San Juan and Puerto Rico is coming along, but we're still working on that, and it's a daily exercise, and it will continue probably for another 3 months.
From a vendor's perspective, from the preparation standpoint, working with the government has really helped us be ready. Through the DTMO program, the U.S. Government Car Rental Agreement, it's up, it's running, it's ready to go. From a GSA perspective, we've got the Rental Supplemental Vehicle Program. So the contracts and the programs are in place, so when the need arises, we've got the, pardon the pun, the vehicle to allow them to procure through either one of those programs. And it couldn't have been a better example of government working with industry to have programs ready to go to support this need and then just the industry itself perspective, surprises and stuff. You always have to be ready for the unexpected, and what you don't know, you don't know. You know, a great example is Puerto Rico. When that storm hit, we tried to establish communication as quickly as we could with our team, and the calls came initially from their cell phones that they could make. The cell phone service was very challenging, so they told us we needed to get them satellite phones. They said, we're running out of power. This is probably the last call I'll be able to make with my cell phone. We need fuel for our generators, and we need phones. So we worked to get them satellite phones. We established communication with them as quickly as we could, and then we worked to get them the diesel fuel they needed to just run their operation, to be able to pump gas into the cars that were available, so we could begin to service the government. And the government understood, and then we identified through partners like Ted where you needed the vehicles, and identifying what vehicles we had available, and I'm sure my counterparts were doing the exact same thing with their companies, finding out what offices were open and where to send them to get the vehicles, because we're sending in this many hundred people. Where do we tell them to go? And so we had to establish that and find out where they were, but we couldn't do any of that until we established communication. And again, made ourselves available too. We had to have our team, available 24/7. And I told my wife initially with Texas, I might be up late tonight and maybe tomorrow through the weekend, taking phone calls, stepping away from the soccer games to take phone calls. I didn't know it was going to last over a month of going 24/7 because storm after storm after storm. So, but again, I think the takeaway there is the preparation, and I can't emphasize this enough, how important those programs were that we have with the government, DTMO and GSA, to make sure we had the proper contracts in place to be able to provide without question. Everything was already worked out. We just needed the orders.
Gotcha. So one of the things we did after Katrina, we formulated what was called the alternate travel mission support sites. We had a group of individuals for devolution planning purposes who were identified so if something happened to the capital region area, who was going to provide that support, or if something happened regionally, so if it was on the West Coast, how could we make sure we had support there? So we had the bright idea of taking folks and giving them debit cards. We put sat phones in the bag. We had everything ready to go. Emergency happens. We get there with our shiny new debit cards. None of the card readers work. You can't swipe any cards. No one has any carbon to make any copies of your card to do that. How does the industry handle that to where you're not immediately given a payment method or any assurance to be reimbursed or to assume the cost of those expenses from an industry standpoint?
That's a really great question. I didn't load that question, but it's a really great question. And again, going to Puerto Rico, where the power grid was gone, and in many cases, in some parts of the country, or the area, the power grid is still gone. We didn't have power, and we were handwriting rental agreements, and people were asking for receipts, and you couldn't print a receipt. You couldn't send them a receipt. We didn't have internet service to do any of that. So we were able to adapt and still rent the vehicles, but we weren't able to give the level of service that you would typically get. So having an understanding from government that we're going to get you the vehicle, but some of this other, it might be a dirty car. It's very likely going to be a dirty car. We want to get you transportation. It may not have a full tank of fuel in it. We can't get you fuel, but the government had access to fuel, but we didn't have access to fuel. So we can get you the car, the vehicle, whatever it was you wanted, and you can go get it. And the other thing was they were asking for a lot of SUVs. I said, well, I don't know what size SUV it's going to be, but my location is telling us we've got 50 SUVs. I have no idea what size they are, but we're putting them over here. Make sure those 50 people show up because I'm putting them over here for you. And we had to make sure that the orders showed up.
But with that, even at that, the receipting and the travel management that we do, we're going to get those receipts for the individuals regardless. Right. In other words, every day we get calls, well, I don't have a receipt for this rental car, I don't have a receipt for this hotel. And fortunately, we can pull up in our computers and see where they were, and we will call and get the receipt or send them the hotel or rental car a message and get the receipts. That's right. Part of our job. And the central build account, or what we call CBAs, are fantastic, and we help reconcile those. If an area doesn't have the receipts or information that they need, we work with them. And to be quite candid with you, the hotels and the rental cars, I think totally we corrected $65,000 worth of just miscellaneous charges that the person shouldn't have been charged or didn't know that he was going to be charged, and so on and so forth. And the rental cars in the hotels, particularly the rental cars, but not a slam to the hotels. The hotels, some of them are individually owned. We have to approach them individually. But we get those folios and we get that information back from them. And so what we try to do is we get calls on a constant basis that is, gee, I need to submit my vouchers quickly, and so we will get them those vouchers as quick as possible. And if there's some type of discrepancy, we do a quality control of the rental car agreement or the hotel bill and make sure that that was what they really contracted for. Because in the heat of the moment, people at rental car counters, they'll sign anything to get their rental car. And so, but we're looking at it from a money situation, and it's entirely different. And so from that standpoint, part of the management is also controlling the flow of information that the people need in order to do their job at that particular time. And it's not uncommon for us to contact a particular hotel and get a block of rooms for a particular period of time. And so then we know exactly how many rooms we've got and what we can do. And in fact, we can load it into our GDS, and if the general public calls in, they cannot see those rooms. We've got the rooms, and we're distributing those out to the particular areas at that time. And FEMA's worked tremendously with us on doing that on a constant basis. We send FEMA probably 3 or 4, it literally was 150 to 200 hotel surveys of any particular area. We'll tell you every hotel in that area, we'll tell you what the condition is of that hotel. If it's got power, if it's not got power, so on and so forth, and what they're expected to be back in operation if they're offline. And so, and those hotel surveys are sent directly to FEMA, and so they know what the availability is, and they'll adjust per diem rates depending on what the need is at that particular point in time. It's not that the hotels are profiteering, but in Georgia, on a weekend, football weekend, try to get a room. So we work with that, and we will actually move people from one hotel to another hotel. Then after the football game is over, we'll move them back into that hotel. And that's some of the intricate maneuvering that we do in every region, every time. We used to know that every route in and out of Baton Rouge and New Orleans, we knew exactly what the traffic was. We knew where every motel was and exactly what their capabilities were. And Sandy was the same.
You bring up a great point about pricing, and something else that we monitor closely, especially now where there's a declared state of emergency, and there's laws that require us to lock our pricing, and our pricing is locked to pre-declaration levels. So to the government's benefit, we make sure that our pricing is locked and that we don't exceed or we don't move our rates throughout the time frame of the storm or the declaration of state of emergency. We also, for these storms, because of the need, we shut every line of business down. And the only way you could have gotten a car in Houston, Dallas, Austin, Texas area, the only way you're going to get a car in southern Florida, and the only way you're getting a car in Puerto Rico is if you were federal government. There was no other line of business that was open for us. That we made sure that the first responders got the cars that were available until we could but truck and drive more cars into the impacted region. And all of ourselves and the other companies, tens of thousands of cars we moved into the impacted area. For Houston, we're moving in all these cars into Houston, and then Florida hit, and some of them went like that. Some of them, Florida's going to need them, so we got them down to Florida, but we made sure that the vehicles were there. Puerto Rico was a different story. Getting more cars into Puerto Rico was something that we never anticipated. We couldn't get more cars into Puerto Rico, so we had to make sure that the vehicles we had in fleet that were still drivable were ready to roll and available, but only to federal government at the locked-in pricing that because of the declaration of state of emergency.
In fact, one anecdote from the standpoint, we got a call storm before that from the Attorney General of South Carolina and wanted to say, I think the rental cars are profiteering off of this. And I said, no, wait a minute. Let's go down this. And once he understood how the system worked, he realized that not only were they getting a good bargain, most of the cars that are rented during the storm are 30-day rentals. And they're rollovers. In other words, if you're out on the road, you don't have to come back. You just notify us that you want to renew, and we'll renew it for you, and you keep right on going. And so it's that type of cooperation between the rental cars, the government. I remember in Baltimore going up to Sandy, we were trying to figure out how can we get all these cars up from to the New York area. And finally we said, what's the obvious? And it reminded me of General Honore. Drive them up. And so actually the rental car people got in the cars and they drove like 1,000 cars up into that region, which was great. And the reaction time is everything to us. It's not only what is the availability of your hotel or your rental car, how fast can you react to a particular situation. For those who are hoteliers here, you can call us anytime, and we have one area that does nothing but hotels, and say, oh, I've got 50 rooms. We may not know that at that particular point in time. So how fast you get to us and say, this is what I think we can do, is everything to us. And if we ask for a 30-day hotel stay and you've got a football game in the middle, say, I can do 8 days, and then I can do 2 days after that, and then I can do another 6 days. In other words, we will take that into consideration. We will not say, if you can't give us 30 days, we're not interested, because we know the availability will change dramatically. So it's like a moving game that is being played out. And if you go inside, I would love for you to come to our offices and just go inside during one of these things. You'll see a lot of yelling, going back and forth. And
a lot of Red Bull, too.
Yeah, right. And all this, and we have some really great people. You're talking about our people for 8 weeks worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we did what we termed flights. We would have, if you worked and got off at midnight, we'd bring you back in at 10 o'clock rather than 8 o'clock, and then work it from that. We had different flights for different areas that were coming in and going off that particular time. For our little company, we spent first 30 days about $600,000 just in overtime that was rolling out on a constant basis. And so, but by the same token, you'll see the synergy inside of how we operate. It does get chaotic, but by the same token, that there's a adrenaline rush that continues. And we love when we come up with another 200 cars in San Juan, or a particular hotel is just reopened, and we got the rooms blocked in.
I can remember some of the phone calls is that stop sending people into to Dallas. We're out of cars in Dallas. Can you send them send them to Love Field? We've got cars at Love. Send them to, and that communication of how many people they had to send in, and us telling them, don't send them there. We don't have cars. Maybe our competitors might call them if that's where you're going, but we have assets available here, here, and here. Can you get them to go there? And just having that level of communication. And then there's also got to be a level of understanding from the end user too. We haven't really talked about that yet. Is that when you get there, we're going to do our best to get you through the process of getting that vehicle as quickly as you can. But remember, there's going to be 200 people, 150 people arriving at the same time, under the same terms and conditions, and there's going to be the lines during this time. We're always calling, how long is the line?
2.5 hours.
Yeah. So it's chaotic, and it's the adrenaline. But we're so happy to serve, but the adrenaline keeps us going. But it's controlled chaos.
Yeah, it sounds from one of the last points that General Honor made yesterday was utilizing commercial capacity, right? So if we don't have the resources available within the government, how are we leveraging that? And it sounds like we're doing some of that,
Right.
and we're taking some steps there. So I want to transition a little bit to talk about what have we learned, how are we going to be more resilient going forward, taking the lessons learned. I'd like to start with Tim to say, do you have any perspective on just what are we doing to ensure, or what I would ask, what are 3 ways you believe that we can be a little bit more resilient internally and working with our partners? And I'll give you guys each an opportunity to answer that as well. But Tim, I'll start with you.
Well, we always harken back to Katrina, and that was really our big event in NORAD, the first big real event that we had to deal with. And we have come such a long way, and by reaching out to partners, working with them ahead of time, opening lines of communications, those are all key. Some of the other things that we do with the partners is we invited them into our exercises. And when we used to do these exercises, it was almost always Armageddon. There was a nuclear detonation, and oh, by the way, there was an earthquake over here, and oh, a hurricane's forming. What are you going to do about it? And we all used to look at that and say, oh, yeah, but come on, is this real? But then you look at this last hurricane season, and you have 3 hurricanes back to back to back, and it's like, doggone, it's real.
Possible.
I mean, it's possible. So working with them and helping them to understand what we require to move them and support them, and then by the same token, what they're trying to do really helps us as far as working together so that when it happens, we can react and we can react quickly. One of the things in DOD is, we want to be last in, first out. We don't want to be competing with commercial industry. We don't want to be competing with civil authorities. We want to be supporting them and complimenting them. So the sooner that we can turn stuff back over to commercial industry and to the normal infrastructure, the better we all are at it. During the hurricanes in the Virgin Islands, the St. Thomas airfield manager wanted to, we were operating Mill Air out of there and offloading cargo, but he wanted to get scheduled air back into his airport. And so what we did was we worked with him and we changed our operations to night operations so that he can have the airport during the day for scheduled airlines and we'd stay out of his way by working at night. Of course, there's some curfew issues and everything, but we did manage to work around that. So the key for us is to open communication before the event, working with our partners and realizing it is truly a whole of government and a whole of community type of support in order to deal with these type of disasters.
Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, I think that we're constantly adjusting. I think everything evolves, and as technology evolves, we handle a hurricane now entirely differently than we did with Katrina. Simply, we have more technology at play, and with that, we found that we can communicate so much better with the field and with the inventories that we have available to us. I think that in the last few, with the surge of the other departments of government coming in and helping FEMA at certain points, probably in retrospect, we would like for them, we don't care what TMC that they're actually using. What we care about is the informational flow. When in a high situation, we will subcontract out to other TMCs in particular areas. We have our 3 or 4 TMCs that we've trained over the years, and they're great support. And as soon as it reaches a maximum, we open our computers to them so they can make reservations, and we're still doing quality control, issuing the tickets, and making sure we're still doing the allotment of the hotels and rental cars, but we're getting that informational flow. I think what we would like to do is probably open up that to the other government TMCs to make sure that that information flows to us. We're not greedy. We need all the help we can get, and so, but the informational flow coming into us is vital because it is a sequence of events. We want to take care of the traveler from the moment that they leave their hometown, they get on the airplane, they get off the airplane, they get a rental car, they get to the hotel, they get to their JFO, and all of that is a sequence of events. If we're missing part of that, then we cannot tell Enterprise or Avis or Hertz how many people are going to be at their ticket counters in the next 2 hours. Ordinarily, we can. We can say, these flights are coming in, you're going to have 250 people at your ticket counter within the next 90 minutes. And that information is vital. It's also vital for the hotels because the hotels, the room availability is fluid. And whoops, well, we got 10 rooms here, we got 30 rooms there, and so on and so forth. But we need that informational flow of when they're going to arrive. If we have a hotel blocked out, and all of a sudden you get a call from a hotel, and they say, your 75 rooms are still standing empty, where are the people? Well, they've helped us, we have to help them then. And so we would then backtrack to see where those people are. But it's much easier when that information is flowing through our computers. We can say, we got a Delta Flight 816, we got 18 people on that, and we can tell you exactly when they're going to arrive at the hotel. That informational flow is everything to us. And so that's an area, what is termed the surge component, that we're going to work on very, very hard. We think it's a brilliant idea, and I liked it very much because it helped us, and it also helped us when FEMA allowed us to put our boots on the ground in different cities to get our intelligence of what was happening at that particular point in time. So those are the little tweaks that we have. But I don't think that, I've seen storms in other countries, and I think that we handle them, we collectively, the government and all the resources, I think they would be surprised how well we really do handle it.
Gotcha. Bryan, before we turn it over to questions from the audience, what's your 3 items or what you think is most important?
I had to write my notes, so forgive me. The first one is making sure that we're ready pre-storm, and that means today, that our operations in the Gulf Coast and the islands, that they all have satellite phones so that we have the ability to communicate with them. That was a lesson we learned this time. The other one was, what we don't know, we don't know. West Virginia got floods. Louisiana had floods. Gatlinburg burnt down. Operationally, we need to be ready to go wherever the issue might happen. And again, what we don't know is terrorist, something might happen in Oklahoma City, it might happen in New York City, it could happen in St. Louis. We've got those markets also have to be ready for something like this. And then we've kind of highlighted it throughout, the underlying theme here has been communication. And I think a good lesson learned from this is putting government, the distributor, and the vendors, hotel, car rentals, there should be, we should find a way to establish when we're at ground zero, so to speak, and we're at the highest point of urgency, there should be daily calls that's organized either through, it should be, my belief, it should be organized through government to have the vendors and the distributors on a daily call to identify what the government's needs are, where the assets are, and what we can do to deploy to make sure that you have the assets, hotel rooms, flights, and car rental that you're going to need to get into the impacted area. And a great example of where that communication could have helped is we're moving cars into Houston, but the FEMA center that was set up was, I think, well over 100 miles outside of Houston, and we didn't have assets there. For Florida, the initial response center was in Alabama, and all of our assets were going to Florida. We could have moved our assets to Alabama to make that. We ended up supplying them, but if we could have had early communication to that, we could have been ready there instead of where we thought the need was going. So that level of communication, I think there should be, especially at the heat of the response, daily debriefing calls between all parties, just so we know what the government's needs are going to be.
We do have the daily call.
Right. Vendors should be on it.
You should be on it, because we do have a daily call. I think that FEMA they're open. FEMA Concur is the masterminds behind all the expense reports and whatnot, and so we're actually a subcontractor of them in those areas. But we do have those, but we could do a better job from our standpoint. We have usually calls every day, even on Saturdays and Sundays. We know we're in the thing with us is we're kind of geography experts. People kept saying, I need to fly into Austin. Well, I can't get you into Austin, but I can get you into Dallas,
right.
And I can get you a rental car in Dallas, and it's not that far. And so we kind of guide the customer along at the same time. If it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you can't find a hotel, and the hotel's been oversold, call us. We're going to find you a hotel somewhere. And the nice thing with Google now, we can tell you, go to McDonald's a quarter of a mile on the left there, and wait for a call in the next 30 minutes. We're going to get you a hotel somewhere. And those are the types of calls that come in and that we deal with on a constant basis. And the service business is a fun business from a standpoint, as I often tell the staff, and they also tell me, who really wins when you give service to people? You do. It's a great job to have, to be able to serve the government, to serve FEMA, and to understand the needs of that individual. I always tell our people, we're in an air-conditioned office complex. They're out on the road, either broken down or in a crowded airport. Their flight canceled. They've got a line a mile long. Probably a good testimony to that. There was a snowstorm 5 or 6 years ago. This is an advertising plug. There's 4,000 people trapped in the Denver airport. We had 2 ski groups there. Ours was one of the few people that we knew the storm was coming. We got them out of there before the flight started to cancel. And that's our job. And when people say, I heard it earlier in the other meetings, what is the relevance of a travel management or travel agents? It's that type of thing. The computers have only added to our capability. People ask me all the time, does the internet want to put you out of business? I said, the internet is the best friend we ever had. When someone comes in and says, I want to go to Botswana, we used to have to dig out a brochure, dust it off from a couple of years ago. Now we Google it up, say, these are your options. We do exactly the same thing for the government traveler. What can I do now? I'm stuck on Route 35. We'll get you someone out there. And we call the vendors, whether it's enterprise, and say, we got a problem here with this particular traveler. That is what the game is all about.
Right.
And that's why it becomes fun. They get, in Aniston's, the FEMA training center. It's not uncommon for them at 10 o'clock at night. We've just released 250 of the people for dispatch to their destinations. And we're thinking, gee, 250 at 10 o'clock at night, let's see how many flights are operating. But it is fun. And those are the challenges that you have. And we know all the advanced teams, the fire and rescue teams that go in, and that they all have to be on one flight coming out of an area so that all their equipment is there and so on and so forth. and they have to have a certain type of vehicle.
Right.
And by the same token, a FEMA person may be a diabetic. He has to have a refrigerator in the room. That's important to us. And that's our job, is to find what we can do at that particular point in time.
It sounds like we're doing the routine well, which is one of the other points that the General brought up yesterday. So with that being said, I'd like to make sure we leave enough time for questions from the audience. How are we doing on questions? Do we have quite a few?
We've got a queue here.
Sounds good. So we'll turn it over to you to ask the questions, and our panel will fire away.
Okay, I'll also try to, some seem they're geared towards a specific panel
Absolutely.
member, and
Fine.
others are kind of broad, the entire panel, so I'll try to help you sort through that a little bit. For NORTHCOM, what is your division of staff between forward and ground in the disaster area, or co-located with the senior FEMA headquarters, versus what you have happening in Colorado Springs? And the second part to that is, does DOD have pre-staged equipment, such as communications gear, MREs, tent-gauge blankets, et cetera, in vulnerable parts of the country?
So for NORTHCOM, as far as forward elements, we do have a team that will go from the headquarters to FEMA National at the first hint of a natural disaster. And that planning team is our eyes and ears on what the requirements and what the needs and anticipated needs that FEMA's having as a lead federal agency. And that team normally consists of a one-star general and a staff of 10 to 15 folks. From our office alone, we try to send somebody out to the Movement Coordination Center so that he or she can see what they're talking about, what they're looking at moving, and so that we can help at the earliest possible moment. And the second part of the question was?
It was about whether Department of Defense has specific disaster relief and contingency stocks pre-positioned in vulnerable areas.
Right. So normally we do not, for civil support, have pre-stage equipment. The exception is DLA, the Defense Logistics Agency, does have an MOU with FEMA, and they do have staged in meals and commodities and the like. So that part is true, but for overall general, for DISCA or civil support, no, we don't have pre-stage, but DLA does a real good job with working with FEMA on that.
Okay, thank you. By the way, if you don't have the app up or submit a question that way, you can come to the microphone with your question. I'll take you first. So maybe there's another. I think this could be for any member of the panel or those that are familiar with what took place there. But it's what could have been done in advance for Puerto Rico to kind of avoid what had happened. In kind of the obvious.
I can take a stab at giving one example of maybe something that could be pre-planned for something. Puerto Rico is so unique because it's not like Texas or Florida where it's easy from a car rental perspective to get cars into there. Getting more assets into Puerto Rico after the storm, it was extremely difficult, nearly impossible, because there's only so many vehicles on the island. So the industry was asked, can we ship cars? Can we rent your cars and ship them into not only Puerto Rico, but also St. Thomas? And the questions came back, we can put cars on ships. If you want to rent them and you want them on a ship, we can get them to the docks and you can get them on the ships. But there were questions that needed to be asked, especially one for St. Thomas. Were we licensed to do business in St. Thomas? What is the tax implications? What are the licensing implications? All that needed to be vetted out before they took those vehicles in there. And then secondly was, what's the exit strategy? You've got to get the vehicles out, and it's easy to bring bulk vehicles into an area, but when vehicle one is done, but 399 are still on rent, you've got to wait for all 399 to get off rent before you ship them all back to us. So those were all questions that hadn't been vetted out before the need was there, and those are all things that we should probably work with government on in the event it were to happen again and the need were to happen again, to know exactly what the implications are. Can we take rental cars into those areas? What is going to be the strategy to get them out of there? Can we absorb them? Meaning, if you brought 500 extra vehicles into Puerto Rico, is there enough demand there for us to keep those vehicles there? So all those things, going forward, we should vet those out, so if the need arises again, we knew the answers, or we would know the answers.
Yeah, part of it definitely was infrastructure in itself. So what, you got the cars there, if you have no gas stations working, what are you going to do? And actually, I got on the telephone with a licensee. In the rental car world, there's corporate owned and there's licensees or franchises. The franchises are a little more challenged to work with. And I got on the phone with one in St. Thomas. He said, I'm not going to rent any cars. And I said, what? He said, I'm not going to rent any cars because the insurance, the trees are down, they're going to wreck my cars, I can't get insurance. And then I began to see what his real problem was. And so we did a workaround on it, but it was tedious. And I think I think Puerto Rico in itself and the Virgin Islands was unique. But what bothered me a little bit was all those islands are susceptible to hurricanes. You can get into the ABC Islands, which are right off the coast of South America, and that's a little off the path. But all the rest of them are right down Hurricane Island. And I was surprised that we had the problems with hotels not having power, and how many of them had generators? Not very many. And that was a real problem up and down the line. And so there should be, perhaps if it's a U.S. territory, the government could do something as far as generators and gas stations and something like that, so that we're not dealing in a third world type of environment. And in my opinion, that's what we were dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And I think from our perspective, if anything, is that we relied heavily on airlift because of the island situation, but we should have diverted more and looked closer and quicker to sea lift. And sea lift brings so much more, one ship can carry so much more than 10 C-17s or C-5s, and we really strained the fleet, whereas earlier in the planning, I think we should have brought in a sea lift option because everything didn't have to go airlift.
Okay, good. I was just handed a question. And I think, based on the panel on the stage, I'm going to kind of go to NORTHCOM with this one. And this again, assuming that your folks have been activated, we've got reserve, active, military. What's the approach for a federal force, or federalized forces for that matter, to handle the removal or relocation of victims of a disaster, and in dealing with whether they really want to cooperate in leaving or not? Is there training involved for folks to help kind of go through this process?
For a pre-landfall, as I mentioned, only Louisiana and Texas, we have evacuation plans pre-landfall. The teams, usually for the airfields, we'll send in teams from USNORTHCOM, their contingency response elements or groups. And those folks are deployed around the world for different contingencies. And so we don't particularly give the training and say just for this type natural disaster evacuation. But those folks are deployed 24/7. They're all around the world and well-versed. In some areas, they're in hostile areas. In others, it's adverse conditions. So those folks know pretty much what they're doing. In addition to that, we use our components. We have an Army component, Air Force, Marines, Navy, and those components. And during Puerto Rico, we deployed our North, which is the Army component to NORTHCOM. And those folks are the ones that work with the folks on the ground to coordinate any type of lift or anything. Now, we had some evacuees based on just getting on aircraft that were flying back empty, but it wasn't a major operation.
Thanks. I think I've just been signaled we've got time for one more. And I'll kind of take one that ties in yesterday's presentation as you did with today. So using Lieutenant General Honore's imperative, don't get stuck on stupid. Can the moderator and the panel each give examples of some big things we in government at all levels should not be doing anymore, or examples of things that we ought to be doing to mitigate the impact of disasters on infrastructure or people?
Yeah, I would say one of the things we really learned when I was at TSA, and we may be beyond that now, but we literally were putting people into cars with guard. It was Secret Service, ICE, Federal Air Marshal Service, because we learned the lesson from the debit cards. We formulated relationships with the banks in these regional areas so that we keep a certain cash repository just for our purposes there. So unfortunately, we were putting them in briefcases and having an armed guard carry them down to where they had to be. But I think increasing the amount of coordination we have with entities that may not first come to mind, responding to a disaster, making sure we're involving the entire community, because there's a lot of value there, there's a lot of willingness to support, and if we can make sure that we're working with the entire community for those areas that are potentially affected and actually maybe even far away from the disaster, making sure those folks are understanding how they can provide support, because a lot of times when these events happen, no one knows how they can really support. They are very willing to do so, but to give them a venue, to give them an opportunity and a window to be able to come in and say, hey, we're here to support, and because of our previous conversations, we now have a path forward to be able to provide that support when it's needed. So that would be my one item.
And if I can try to take a stab at answering that, I think it's important that we focus on the positives of what happened here. We've been tested with single hurricanes. Ted mentioned Hurricane Sandy and how industry worked with government to respond, but to have 3 major hurricanes back to back to back, and that the programs that the government has developed with the car rental, with the hotels, and with the airline, both DTMO and GSA, to have those programs all function the way that they've been designed to function, so that government can work with the distributors, that they can work with the vendors to provide the service to get government doing what government needs to do in these situations. It's an amazing story of how all of that gelled together so that the government could assist in the recovery efforts in those 3 impacted regions. It's an amazing story of how all those programs work the way they're designed to work. I think that's the positive story here. And there's things that could always be done a little bit better and a little bit different, and those are the learning experiences that we take away from this. But it worked. It gave us the tools to be able to provide the service that the government needs in a situation like this.
And I think that you can always tweak the nuances a little bit, but when you look at it in a broad scale, you had 3 major hurricanes in sequence with each other, and to come out of it as we did in helping, we still have a lot of the survivors that are wanting to go back to Puerto Rico, and we're dealing with that now. But each portion of it has been methodically looked at now, and I think that we're all better for going through it. But by the same token, we did learn some lessons from it that we could do better and work at it. But I think that by the same token, when you look at organizations such as FEMA, we see them close up, and occasionally they yell at us, and that's okay. But they do such a marvelous job in coordination, and they're so open to suggestions that we've had going back to them. And that's been a real great relationship. And then us working with all the distributors. In my former life, I was with the airline operations, and I know a lot about the airlines and how they operate. And let me tell you, the U.S. Airlines, there's no one that rivals them anywhere in the world. But by the same token, you have the rental cars and the hoteliers, they want to help, and they would give us estimates. I think we can be back online in 24 hours, we'll give you a call, and they would call, and they say, we want to make it, put us back in the GDS system, and we'll get the rooms and so on and so forth. So these spots were all along the line, and so I think we've come, and from a technology standpoint, there's a world of difference between Katrina and where we are today, just in our technology internally. The computers and the technology that we have internally amaze me on a constant basis every day of what our capabilities really are.
So I'm now getting the Oscars treatment, to where I think we're getting ready to play the Wrap It Up music really soon. But I think this is a great example of the value of NDTA, bringing the industry together to be able to have these conversations and have this dialogue. I think we've got a recurring session I think we have now to be able to talk about emergency preparedness going forward as we continue to have the NDTA event. So I really want to thank NDTA, DTMO, GSA, and all the folks who are involved in this effort, because I think we're starting to really see the true value of the NDTA event. I hope you guys found this to be informative, but before the Admiral pushes me off, I'll get off the stage. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Hey, well, I really would like to thank Marques, Timothy, Ted, and Bryan. A lot of insight. The interconnectivity between FEMA, NORTHCOM, the TMC. First time I'd heard about the TMC connectivity with FEMA, that's important, and then of course industry, and seeing how the travel industry, hotels, rental cars, airlines really fit into it, and hearing some of the lessons learned and how important it is to be prepared, and for the big ones, the little ones. So you're handling a large scale, and it's always sensitive, and it's always in the press. So, our hats off to you guys for the work you do. But I think we're going to continue to have this dialogue about how we can be ready. So I thank you for your time, and Marques, thanks for running.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, we're going to shift